So in part A of this lab, we have the effect of manipulation and different flours on muffins. So we have the bread flour and then the cake flour. I labeled them just BF and then CF. So yeah, that is basically what part A is about. So in this first batch here, we have the understirred cake flour batch. These two muffins, in my opinion, almost look like a biscuit. Just the way the texture was. It's a little bit smooth. It's a little bit bumpy in some spots. And as you can see, there is some light browning on the top, but it's definitely very sporadic. These ones definitely did not round very evenly either. Like, they didn't rise nor like round very evenly. They were kind of like slanted. So yeah. And then just to get a little bit of a better look on the inside here, as you can see, it's very dense. There's just like very small air pockets all throughout. And this muffin was definitely very dry and crumbly. And it just generally, when I tasted it, reminded me more of a biscuit. And I mean, you could definitely just tell that the ingredients were not evenly distributed in this batch, because the taste and just the texture wasn't like exactly even in all areas because of just that understirring. So next we have the moderately stirred cake flour batch. I labeled MC. So as you can see, these have a bit of a smoother top to them, and just because these were mixed a little bit more, that the more mixing caused, the ability for it to smooth out a little bit more, just causing it to be less clumpy. And as you can see too, the browning is a little bit more even on the tops of these as well. And I think that is partially due to the fact that the ingredients are also more evenly distributed, because, when the sugar and the fat and all that stuff is more evenly distributed, then, that browning can really happen a little bit more evenly. These ones also did rise a little bit more compared to the previous batch, and that is because the gluten was able to develop more from just the more stirring. And then looking at the inside, you can see that it's pretty similar to the way that the first batch looked. Had mostly small air pockets in it. There are some like bigger ones, but they're not really like that large. Taste wise, it was a little bit lighter, kind of like spongier than the first batch. But these ones were also, like, even though they were spongier, they were also still quite dense. And I think because, of the higher gluten development, that's partially why you see this contrast of it, it is still spongy, but it's also dense at the same time. But yeah, the overall texture was definitely more even though, just since the ingredients were just more mixed together. So lastly, we have the over-stirred cake flour batch. The first thing I noticed about this batch was the browning. As you can see, there's like hardly any browning on the tops of these. They're also a little bit smoother too, which, obviously is because it was just mixed rigorously, so it just really got that batter very smooth. I believe the reason for the less browning is probably due to the excessive gluten development. And when this happens, the batter just becomes too dense for the heat to reach the top of the muffin properly. And as you can see, the muffin on the left has a peaked top, but it did not rise evenly. And this is also just because of how dense the batter is, which prevents it from rising properly. So yeah. So when I cut open these muffins, there were some large tunnels throughout the muffins. And this is because when gluten overdevelops, it creates a really strong elastic network that is able to trap gases during baking just like excessively. So it creates these really, really large air pockets. These muffins tasted, I would say, definitely very similar. But the only major difference between like all three batches and this one specifically is these muffins were very like rubbery and kind of gummy like, whereas the other two were like a little bit more crumbly. So yeah. And, you know, obviously the air pockets in here are very uneven. You know, we have large tunnels, and then we've got on the other side here, you know, it just very small air pockets, uneven, you know. So moving on to our understirred bread flour muffins, this batch was very distinguished in their top. As you can see, there's a lot of texture and bumps just all throughout the muffin top. And this is just because the ingredients were not very well mixed, just leading to a very uneven and lumpy texture as it baked. As you can see, there's a little bit of browning, but only in a couple of spots. And I believe this is because, you know, since the ingredients were not evenly distributed, you know, some spots have more or less sugar, fat, and leavening, which can, you know, disrupt that browning process. So yeah. So looking at the inside of this muffin, it's very dense. There are some small air pockets. There are unevenly distributed. When I tasted this batch, I did notice that the texture was quite dense in some areas, but it's also softer in others. And, you know, again, like this uneven distribution just really has a lot of effects on, you know, the overall taste and texture of the muffin. You know, it's also pretty dry, I would say as well. You know, and overall, like, even though it was slightly different than the cake flour, it wasn't really all that much different, in all honesty, because it was still pretty dry and crumbly and just very bland. Alright, so next up we have our moderately stirred bread flour muffins. Just looking at this batch, you can see that they're much smoother and just even in the way that they rose compared to the previous batch. And like I mentioned before, the distribution of the sugar, fat, and leavening does have a huge impact on the browning. And since the ingredients were much more evenly distributed in this batch, you can see how that affected the browning. So yeah. So looking at the inside of these muffins, you can see the air pockets are more evenly distributed, but they are still quite small. As soon as I tasted these muffins, I noticed they're a little bit lighter and just like softer and more airy compared to the previous batch. And even though like they were still dense, I noticed that when I applied pressure, it was more sponge-like than the previous batch. And overall, I'd say like these ones, just like texture and taste-wise, were a little bit more appealing because, you know, obviously the ingredients are more evenly distributed, so you have a more even just like taste and just generally more appealing. So lastly, we have our overstirred bread flour muffins. This batch was very distinguished in its height. Out of all the muffins I did for part A, these rose a lot more than the rest. And as you can also see, the browning was darker on the top. And like I mentioned before with the cake flour muffins, the increased surface area allows for more heat to get to the muffins, so I think that's like partially why. And then interestingly too, you can see these had like more distinguished bumps in the top, and I think that's actually because the gluten, when it overdeveloped, the texture just became uneven. So looking at the interior, you can see the air pockets are a little bit more noticeable than in the previous batches. There was no tunneling like in the overstirred cake flour batch. These ones felt just about as dense, or maybe actually a little bit more dense than the understirred batch. However, even though it was denser, the taste overall was just very similar. Other than the fact that this was one thing that was very distinguishing. It was very like gummy-like. And this is because just when the gluten overdevelops, that's what happens. It causes that weird like chewy and gummy kind of texture to happen. So for part B of this lab, we looked at the effect of fat on muffins. So as you can see here, this is my first variation with 0 tablespoons of oil. And just so you know, I did use all-purpose flour for all of these batches. So looking at the top, you can see that these muffins are definitely not smooth. They look very gritty and bumpy, with some lighter browning, but you know, only in like a couple spots. These ones did rise, you know, a decent amount and somewhat evenly, I would say. They were very dense and very dry, like so dry it was gross. Tasted like the driest biscuit I've ever had, even though it's supposed to be a muffin. And obviously because there's no oil in this, that really does affect the tenderness and the moisture of the muffin. It was very crumbly and yeah, just not good. And then as you can see here, on the inside, you know, we have some pretty small air pockets, and it's pretty crumbly. So yeah. So looking at this next batch, as you can see, these ones are a lot less brown, and they are a little bit more smooth, not as gritty like. I think the reason that these ones are less brown than the previous batch is because the previous batch probably had more sugar concentrated toward the top of the surface of the muffin, because I read something that like that can happen when there's no oil in the muffin. And then another thing too is with these ones, you know, they have oil, and oil basically coats flour, and this leads to just a little bit less gluten formation, and with less gluten formation, you will see a smoother top, and then, you know, like when we saw in the previous batch, you know, there's no oil, so that this causes just that more like gritty and textured looking top. So yeah. So looking at the inside, these muffins had some larger air bubbles or air pockets compared to the previous batch. And that's partially because oil also does help leaven. It is a liquid, so it does help in that aspect. These muffins were also definitely softer and just less dense compared to the previous batch. When I tasted them, they were just like a lot more light and airy, you know, like a normal muffin would be. So yeah, these ones would definitely be more of a desirable taste for a muffin. Not quite what you would find in the store, but definitely closer to that. So lastly, we have our variation with 3 tablespoons of oil, and as you can see, these ones had the smoothest looking tops with very minimal browning, but you can see in the spots that it didn't brown, they are pretty dark, especially on the one like very pointed muffin here in the front. I imagine since that one peaked taller than the other two, that's partially why it did brown more. And the high oil content of this batch definitely helped to hydrate the flour, leading to a smoother top. And like I said before, you know, the oil coats the flour, leading to a little bit of a less gluten formation, which also really helps smooth out that top as well. So yeah. So looking at the inside, you can see there are some large air bubbles throughout this muffin, and the reason for this is the higher oil content does help the baking powder to create these larger pockets, because you know, fat does help with leavening. The These muffins were also definitely the softest, lightest, most airy of all three variations. And I would say in general, these just tasted a lot more like an actual muffin because they were more tender and moist, due to that higher fat content. And they didn't like fall apart when I was trying to break them open. They didn't like completely crumble. So yeah, definitely just like a lot more desirable of a taste in general.